Welcome everyone. We're gonna give it a minute and a half for everyone to show up, and then we'll start. Our conversation. Maybe we should have like a hold music or like music. Maybe we should ask
like elevator music.
or we should ask people, the panelists, what their favorite song is, and we can play that. Someone like me, I don't really do a lot of music, so but I have a feeling you do, Jared. Seems like you're into music.
I listen to music pretty much all throughout the day, and I have like music rituals for the weekends and things like that. But I never think about it when I'm in meetings. But on the design team, there are a number of people who do, and I would say they're pretty much like part-time DJs. Like Mickey, one of our design directors, like we were in a meeting recently, we were like a group meeting where he faded in the music like really well. And then we had discussion, and then like he brought back the music and faded it out. And I'm like, dude, like this is very professional,
Yeah, that's the best part about design. You get to work with some really creative people, and if you're creative in one org, you're creative and talent for one, you have talent for others.
Yes. Yep.
Fantastic. Well, let's get started. Welcome everyone to our monthly webinar series. Super excited, super psyched to be talking to Jared. Jared is an advisor, a friend, a customer. I have learned so much about design, and not just not those kind of nitty-gritties of design, but also the philosophy of design. Jared has been an amazing mentor for that. For those of you who don't know Jared, he is VP of Design and GM of Performance at Lattice. He was one of the earliest employees at Lattice. And Lattice, as we all know, is now a unicorn, a multi-time unicorn, a very big organization. So Jared has seen grown Lattice from very humble beginnings to very large, very impactful company it is today. So welcome, Jared. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is going to be fun.
Before we start, you have a lot of guests we have. You have had a really interesting background. So love to hear, about your background, how you ended in design, how you ended at Lattice.
Sure. Yeah. So let's see. I was born in New York, and very early, I'd say like my first 10 years, I spent some time in a number of places. So spent some time in Europe and Sweden. My father is ethnically Nigerian, but lived in Sweden for a very long time. It's where my parents met and got married. So when I was born, my mom and I moved over there, as well as my brother. And also spent some time in Trinidad. My mom's Trinidadian. So I learned a little bit about Caribbean and South American culture. And eventually my family settled in Maryland. And that's where I went to like middle school and high school and things like that. I think somewhere along the lines of like upper middle school, like early years high school, I started developing a passion for writing. It was just like a nice way for me to express my thinking, and just the way that I kind of like view the world and things that I just observed. And over time, I kind of morphed into a focus on tech in particular, like tech journalism, and did that for a bit while in high school. My peers and my friends didn't know I was in high school, but I didn't think that was an important piece of information. But it's during that period of time that I really started to develop this obsession for technology, right? And particularly design, because I was really fascinated with just the opportunity to identify a problem that someone has and shape a solution that actually provides value to them. So I kind of took that kernel of a nugget, and over time kind of developed that into a career. And that started by me starting a company. This was late 2000s. And then eventually I realized that like San Francisco was like the mecca for tech. And if you really wanted to pursue a tech career, it made sense to be around like-minded people. So eventually I moved to San Francisco. This was around 10 years ago. And then I was there for a bit, worked at some early stage companies. I was very attracted to 0 to 1 and starting with nothing and creating something out of that. And through a series of movements, stumbled across two incredible people, Jack Altman and Eric Hassel, who I worked with together at Teespring. And one day Jack reached out and said, hey, Eric and I are leaving Teespring. I had left already to start a company where we want to focus on helping people maximize their hours of work and really get a lot out of their jobs. And I was really passionate about that problem space and decided to join them. And that's how I ended up at Lattice. And I've now been at Lattice for about 5.5 years. And along the lines, I kind of dabbled in other things. Eventually, I picked up a passion for investing and as a way to just kind of like develop my exposure to more founders and more markets. And on the side, I am obsessed with playing pool. I can play pool hours a day. I'm still thinking about like replacing this couch behind me with a pool table. So yeah, that's a bit about me.
That's fascinating. I think every designer I talk to has a unique journey, and yours is definitely one of the more unique ones. But that's kind of the best part about being in design is being able design and research is everybody has a unique story to tell.
Yes.
So I think the topic on everybody's mind, especially in the tech world, especially in the startup world, is the current macro environment. Right, that's one of the things that we talked about when we were, promoting this conversation. That's one you and I talked about when we were prepping about this conversation, prepping for this conversation. So the resources are getting strapped. Macro environment is not the best. What do you think the role design has in an organization, specifically, or in any organization, when things are when the market is where it is?
It's a great question. So what I find interesting about it is that I think my answer is the same no matter the market. I think it's just that the superpower of the design discipline becomes more pronounced when resources are strapped, right? And I really see 3 parts to this. So the first is, designers, especially today in technology companies, need to have a deep understanding of what's important to the business. And that starts with understanding how the business makes money, how it delivers value, how that value is rewarded, whether that's through like, a SaaS-based revenue model where you're being paid for a seat, or an ad-based model where you're being paid for impressions or whatnot. And then it necessitates understanding what's important to the business at that time, right? Like what is the business struggling with? What are the gaps? What are the problems, right? If a designer first has that base understanding, then the second piece comes into play, which is looking at the org chart and identifying what gaps does the org chart create, right? I remember this viral tweet years ago where someone was like, you can quickly tell where a group of PMs disagree by opening up like the menu of any product, right? Like if you open up the menu in an app or like on a website or whatnot, you can just see like, okay, these are all the things people could not agree on. So they just shoved it inside this drawer, right? But what's fascinating about design is that we have this like, this appetite and this desire to look across, right? So even if we're put in a box or put in like a vertical, we just can't help but look across, right? And where that becomes very powerful is when you're looking across an org chart. And you're starting to ask yourself, okay, well, if our org chart optimizes for this, this, and this, it likely means that we're probably not thinking about this or not pursuing this opportunity as much as possible, right? So now if you take these two things together and you connect them, then you're starting to identify opportunities that the rest of the business is likely not acting on, but could potentially be very, very powerful and rewarding, right? And then I think that's where the third piece of design comes into play, which is time to learning. If you think about like the toolkit of design, right? Like we open up a canvas in Figma, it doesn't take too long for us to start throwing out ideas and creating visual artifacts that people can react to and get excited about, right? I've seen many cases where a prototype led to funding, right? Not like a deck, not like a bunch of charts and all that stuff, just like a thing, like that's something someone can react to or like interact with or what have you, right? So I think that these 3 things, like understanding the business, understanding what the business's org design affords and what it also leads to there being gaps in, and then actually leveraging the skill set of design to reduce the time to learning, to understand like, hey, like if we were to pursue this, could it actually result in X, Y, and Z for the business, right? This is always true of design, but when resources are strapped, when like you have a reduced number of people to do a thing, that's when the superpower really shines.
That's a really great point. And even though we had some of this conversation, I didn't expect this response. So let's dig deeper a little bit. So from my understanding, what you're saying is, design has this ability and skill to look for opportunities that other parts of the org might not be looking for. And in this case, when I'm saying design, I mean we're probably looking at design and research, because that's this is part of the research function of design, to look for opportunities. Yep. So design has this unique viewpoint within the org, and also has the skill to not only kind of find those opportunity, but also be able to quickly figure out how to take advantages of this opportunity. Yes. How can this impact the org in a positive way, which in today's environment is probably mostly, do you bring in more customers? How do you keep your existing customers?
Yep. Yes, and that's a fair playback, because even when the term experience design was coined, I think it was Don Norman during his time at Apple. The way he referred to it was, it does not begin when your user enters your product. It begins when your potential user becomes aware of your offering, right? So every touch point, from seeing the first ad for a business, to talking to talking to like a sales rep, to purchasing the product, to installing the product or downloading it for the first time, to using it, to eventually turning off the product, is all within the remit of design, right? And I think that designers that kind of like lend their minds to that way of thinking, their purview begins to transcend org design, right? They're not thinking about like, I'm like on the growth team, or I'm on the this, right? They're just thinking about the experience of the customer. And that lens, that point of view, especially when filtered against whatever is very, very important to the business at any given time, is very, very, very powerful, right? And I think that like, if you are a designer listening to this right now and you're thinking about, how can I deliver more value to my business during this period of time? How can I deliver more value to my customers? It's really leaning into those two things, right? Like our ability to see across, and then cross-cutting that against what's important to the business, right? And then everything else from there is just muscle memory, because at that point you're hopping into Figma and you're acting on what you're observing, right? You're acting on your hypothesis. And like, it's much faster for a designer to do that action and get like a feedback loop on it, right? Because we're not building anything, right? Like I can mock up something and be like, hey, based off of X, Y, and Z, I think this is an opportunity. Should we go down this path, right? And I've seen that just cut through so many documents and meetings about meetings and docs about docs, right? Because like, it's an artifact, something people can react to and be like, maybe there's a there, let's pursue it,
Yeah, and I think that artifact, I absolutely agree. Producing artifacts like that is the superpower of designers. And you mentioned like, companies even raising, a lot of money based on these, wireframes. Our company, Marvin, did that. When we pitched Marvin to investors, there was no product. We just had some wireframes, and it gave people something tangible to look at and feel with and play with, and that can move the organization forward, especially in lean times when a lot of times speed is going to be of the essence.
Yes. Yep.
Do you see that as, I was going to ask you about next year, because it seems like, this is not going to be a V-shaped recovery. So we as, companies and leaders and design leaders and design practitioners are going to have to prepare for next year to be as lean as the second half of this year was. Do you think in 2023, is that what, or beyond, is that the new normal for designers to be, these, people who are looking at cross-functionally, cross-business wise, having that visibility, looking for opportunity, that the other parts of the org, or maybe the siloed product SKUs are not seeing? Is that kind of a core competency that you look for as a design leader, or that you think is a core part of being a designer is going to be more and more important next year?
I think so. I think that 2023 and beyond will more or less serve as a accelerated maturation of the design practice. Like, I think there are things that we fully understand about our discipline already. We understand that empathy is very important. We understand that no matter what a PRD says or what metric we're trying to move, ultimately what needs to happen is that we're producing value for our customers, right? Like we understand all those things already. I think this piece around like being able to look across, have a unique perspective as a result of that, time to learning or time to insight are things that we kind of like subconsciously know, but have never been like forced to be pulled to the forefront because we're exiting an unprecedented bull run where people are just hiring like literally every day, right? So no one really needed to think about efficiency so much, right? Most businesses were actually very inefficient, right? But now efficiency is really coming to the forefront, right? And I think that we have all the ingredients to make businesses more efficient. And that's the part that we are now going to be forced to really shape and articulate as a core competency of the design practice. And like I said, like I don't think it necessitates us changing anything about the way we work, more so than leaning into the natural dispositions of how we do things, right? Like, and I think a tactical example of this is that I've actually seen over the years that like, as a design practice, we started to ironically slow down like our pace, like the how quickly we do things, right? Like I think we now have an obsession with writing documents, for example, right? And scheduling meetings and talking to a customer before we put down like an idea and an artboard and all that stuff. And I get where that's coming from. I think that was kind of like a response to like design seat at the table, which is very much like a common term a couple of years ago, where it's like, well, now we're at the seat. Now we need to emulate our peers and like, do what they do. Well, they write a bunch of docs. We need to write a bunch of docs. They do a bunch of stuff before they do work. We need to do a bunch of stuff before we do work, right? But I think that like, we also need to recognize the uniqueness of our seat, right? We are a craft-based discipline, right? Like our craft can't get lost or like, pushed to the wayside or pushed further down our process. It needs to run parallelized to the rest of the business processes. And I think like internalizing that allows us to lean into the natural efficiency that's built into our craft.
That's such a very well put. I think I like this idea of no matter who we are craftsmen first, and being true to the craft. That's just something really, really powerful there. And so obviously the market is shifting. The expectations from the design and research org is shifting. At the same time, the tool set is shifting very rapidly, probably more rapidly in design and product development than pretty much anywhere else. Like the most impactful, the most surprising part of 2022 in terms of technology has been OpenAI's DALL-E and their OpenAI's ability, I don't know what they call it, the coding ability to write code, right? So on one end, we have our responsibility as design and research leaders that's shifting. And on the other hand, the tool set that we can rely on is becoming more and more sophisticated. If you were to take a more kind of a more pessimistic look, it's almost kind of automating a large part of what designers were doing. I don't agree with that, but that's another take that you could take.
Sure.
How do you reconcile those two pieces? How do you think that the design and research as a profession is going to look like once the dust settles?
Sure. Yeah, so this is very much a hypothesis, and it might even be a contrarian point of view. So I'll just caveat with that. But my answer here is grounded ironically, in a framework, the double diamond. The double diamond is something that, we like to talk a lot about in design. And for anyone listening that's not aware of it, it's two diamonds, and it basically captures the design process, right? So the first diamond focuses on building the right thing. And then the second diamond focuses on building that thing right? So you go from, we have this observation or what that observation might imply, right? And then we converge into a clear problem statement of something that we want to solve, right? At that point, we know this is the thing that we need to build. And then we go and diverge again and consider all the ways in which we can solve that problem statement. And then we home in on like the actual thing, and then we ship it, and that's building the thing right? And what's interesting about the design practice, design and research included here, but more so the product design side, is that over the past, like, let's say like decade and a half, designers have gone from just focusing on the latter diamond, the building the thing right, and we've actually moved upstream and now contain the building the right thing, right? And how this plays out is that the designer is no longer brought into a project when a wireframe for the actual thing is done, right? Like our job is no longer like, hey, just like add coat of paint on it, right? Like if that was still our job, then we're just operating in that ladder diamond, right? Now our job is like, hey, our customer said the site's too slow. We don't think it's like, site reliability. We think it's like some weird workflow. Go figure that out, right? Now that's the remit of a designer. And that's where like our close partnership with research comes into play. So I think that has been the evolution of the practice of the past decade, right? I think what the evolution in tooling is now doing is it's probably over time skewing our distribution from these two diamonds from like, call it 30-70 or 50-50 to more like 70-30, right? Where like our emphasis and energy is now being over time being more spent on building the right thing, and then less so on building the thing right. And why? Because things like advancements in tools and technologies, things like design systems, like there's a lot of things that allow us to spend less time on building the thing right, because there's a lot of common patterns and ways that we can do those things quickly, right? I don't actually see this as a bad thing. I see it as a shift of energy and focus. I actually believe that as a lot of things get commoditized within technology, for everything from like workflows and apps to like overall like business models, I think that like the energy of the design mind being put more to building the right thing is actually great for society, right? And in turn, that actually unlock a lot of new opportunities and things that we're not seeing right now, because over time we focus more energy on like building the thing right. I do think that like this then potentially creates another potential shift, which is the role of PM and design. I actually believe that in a world where design starts to focus more on building the right thing, that the job of a PM and the job of a designer starts to converge more and more, right? Like I think it's a classic conversation when a designer joins a company and a PM joins a company, and they're coming from different companies. There's always that norming stage of like, okay, like how do you work with the designer? How do you work with the PM, right? And like it's always because we know that there's always been this overlap between the two when designers started thinking about building the right thing, right? And like I said, like if our energy begins to shift more to that upper diamond, then I think that overlap with PM just becomes more and more pronounced, to the point that like it might actually become one job. I don't know. That's my personal take, right? Then that begs the question of like, well, craft, right? Like, does that like kill our craft? And I don't actually think so. I think that there's ways to develop craft in that upper diamond, the way in which we think about building right things, right? Or finding new opportunities for business. I think that the kinds of businesses that exist might also grow over time. I know that crypto is kind of like entering a winter, but I think it was only like 9 months ago that we were talking about like, DAOs, right? As like a new potential kind of like business structure. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts on it. Yeah.
So does that mean, and I agree, I think it's a natural evolution, philosophically, of kind of the human condition, right? Like there's stuff that can be automated, will be automated, might take some time.
Yeah.
Does that mean that both research as a practice or research as both research as a practice, so research that's done both by researchers and non-researchers, and research as a professional, research with a capital R, are they finally getting their time under the sun?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Like when you can no longer differentiate on the way a workflow works, you begin to differentiate on the workflows you decide are worth building, right? And that's just like a fancy way of saying like the opportunities that you choose to pursue, right? And I think that is where research is immensely valuable. So yes, I do think that that accelerates the a broader company's understanding of the value of research.
And then what does that mean for, you know, for the argument of building specialization, right? For the longest, I think there's a question right here. This is really kind of nicely gels with the thought I had. What does that, you know, there has been a steady increase in this specialization, especially in the research practice.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean for that double diamond? Now that everybody, you know, designers are going to be expected to do research or be at least some part researchers. If, you know, maybe we can take the argument to its, you know, to the limit and say like, you know, designers would be researchers first because the design could be automated. Where does that lead the specialization argument and the specialization movement that's been going on in design research for the past few years?
Yeah, it's a good question. And honestly, I'm not sure. I think that in the long term, I'm not sure directionally where that heads. I do think in the short term, it likely doesn't mean anything though. Because so for example, you know, tomorrow we have like an all hands for our product development org. And Aruna, our research director, she just sent me a Loom yesterday where she was talking me through the presentation she plans on delivering at this all hands. And one of the things she's talking about in this presentation is the fact that talking to a customer, like literally the act of getting on a customer call, is one of many tools in the toolkit of a researcher, right? Yet it is the one that has become synonymous with the word research, right? So people just think like, oh, research is just talking to customers. Like I can do that myself, right? But the reality is that the research toolkit is very, very wide. It encompasses quantitative methods, qualitative methods. And if you really, really go down like the real sociology and like psychology paths of like PhD programs and research, there's a bunch of stuff that researchers do beyond just hopping on a customer call, right? So like, you know, this macro view that I'm saying of like this emphasis more on building the right thing as a result of the latter half being commoditized over time makes it very, very prudent for companies to be very, very good at identifying unique opportunities, right? And I think to do that, that actually necessitates specialization because like if everyone will hop on the exact first tool, right, which is talk to a customer, right? So then like your ability to leverage these other more bespoke tools that people may not even be aware of actually comes to the forefront and shines, right? So that's why I'm saying like in the short term, I don't actually think it means any actual material shift for specialization. Maybe in the long term it does, but for that long term, I'm not sure what direction it takes.
It's a really, really good point. But yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, when I was studying research, you know, the qualitative method, quantitative methods, you know, qualitative research or qualitative data analysis itself is a specialized semester long course on just analyzing qualitative data.
Yep.
Right. So I think research as an industry beyond just academia, I think we have probably only scratch the surface on what research is, and I think the new world in the double diamond world, I definitely see the value of research increasing, and so much so that you know we probably need even somewhat more specialization. In the field, and that's a really good sign because I've always maintained that I think we can do a better job as an industry. Research can do a better job at not just you know showcasing the value, but also just doing better work, more sophisticated work. So this kind of leads me into my next question, which is around design leadership, right? Like you have seen design leadership evolve over the past, you know, decade, more than a decade. Let's start there. How have you seen the design leadership evolve over the last 10 years? And then follow up with how do you see that shifting, the leader's role shifting in the next few years?
Yeah. So I think the biggest shift I've seen for design leadership is that we've gone from speaking one language to being bilingual. And what I mean by that is if design is a craft-based function, any leader of a design discipline can obviously speak the language of the craft, right? Like we know how to show up in a critique, give directional guidance that helps a designer get their work to the next level, right? And I think that over time, you know, as a result of things we've intentionally done as a practice, and then also just over time, CEOs and founders seeing the benefit of design, we have been brought into this figurative table that we so for a long time wanted to see that, right? But I think that when we got that seat,
when we were finally there,
huh?
we wanted to be
Say
at
that
that
again.
table. I think the designers really wanted to be at that table. I think
Yes.
I remember having these discussions in 2012. Like
Yeah.
design should be
Yeah.
on the leadership table.
Yes.
It's finally happened. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think what happened initially was when we got that seat, we were akin to being at a table with a bunch of people who speak the same language, and then you now come and sit down, you speak a different language. So you can't understand them and they can't understand you, right? I think that's what initially happened when design got its figurative seat, right? So design leaders were then forced to contend with this fact of like, okay, some group has to budge. Either I need to learn their language, or I need to convince these 7 or 8 other people at this table to learn my language, right? And numbers went out in that scenario. 7 or 8 all speak that language, so you got to learn it, right? And to make this more tactical, the language I'm talking up here is the language of business, right? So over time, design leaders had to learn that other language. And in doing so, we become bilingual, right? We can show up in a design meeting and speak to our designers, but we can also show up in a leadership or an executive meeting and speak to a bunch of non-designers, right? I think this has been very, very powerful.
The same conversation, the same path that CTOs took, where
exactly
they were learning the language of the engineer. They spoke the language of engineers, and then they had to translate that. But this happened, early 2000s.
Well, for engineering, it happened decades ago because as a practice, it's more mature and it's older. But yeah, so design, I would say we probably hit that, probably around like 2 or 3 years ago, or like 5 years ago. I think we're still learning it. Like, I think it's like, I don't think we've hit 100% fluency, but we're conversational, which is good, right? So now I think that like, when we look forward, there's 2 things that need to happen. We need to go from conversational to actual 100% fluency. And I think the delta there lies in our ability, like our speed of translation, right? Like you talk about, like when you hit a point of fluency is like when you can think in that other language. We as design leaders, we still think in design and then try and like conjugate or not conjugate, translate over to business, right? So we need to hit that point of fluency where we can actually think in business and then translate back into design, right? I think that affords a second piece that needs to happen in the future, which is that of like our sphere, like our aperture, like what are we looking at, right? Coming back to a point I made earlier, when Don Norman initially coined the term of experience design, he was referring to the entire life cycle of a customer, not just their time within your product. I think today, though, a lot of design leaders are still scoped to that, right? Some get to branch out a little bit, and what that traditionally looks like is when a design leader also has the brand design function report up into them. Because typically when that happens, then by nature, you also need to think about go-to-market, which is good, right? But I think that's the next piece that's really going to be, evolution to the design leadership practice, right? Like widening our aperture, like what's the horizon at which we're looking at our customer, and then like how are we beginning to have influence at other touch points that are outside on either side of the time when they're actually in the product that we build.
Is that what you're saying? Because you're not just a head of design at Lattice, you also run the performance part, right? Like you're the GM of performance. How is that what you're seeing as well? Kind of this idea that design has, if I understand you correctly, design has talked the talk. They are able to talk that talk. We have develop a common language that with the business, that businesses start to build, we start to build that trust with the business leaders, with the CEOs and the board, that we deserve a seat at the table. Now it's time to walk the walk, as you are, as designs have, as it's expected from the design to start making real business impact, real impact in, opportunities and, revenue and growth.
So kind of what I'm actually saying on that latter point is that we have been doing that, right? But what is the aperture that we look at when we're trying to do that? Is it strictly for the time when our user is in the product, or are we having influence outside of that as well, right? Like, is a designer thinking about, the connection between the value proposition that their sales AE says and what their CSM then needs to support on the other side, right? Like a design leader can actually see those two things, right? Like if you're actually thinking about the full life cycle of a customer, you can identify gaps in that and basically preempt churn, right? Because typically when you think about churn, like there's external factors and business factors and all that stuff, but sometimes it really comes down to, I was sold X, but I got Y, right? The design leader can see that, right? But they're not going to see that if they're only focusing on like user actions and this, right? Like the rest of these things are actually part of the user experience as well, So that's really what I'm getting at, where it's like the sphere of influence, or the aperture by which we think about how we can have influence will widen.
And so design leadership is not just about product anymore. It goes across.
Yeah, that's my take. And I think that coincides with my other hypothesis that over time, design starts to first the two diamonds, right? Because in that first one, like it's agnostic of if you're talking about product or not, right? We're just strictly talking about business opportunities.
Does that mean that design leadership has practice? Design leaders, even though design has a very, people can take various paths into design. Design leadership's path was fairly straightforward. You would be you would be a designer at a company. You would be doing a lot of times you would be doing UI design or visual design. You'd be sometimes you'd be doing UX design, but that was rare. Does that mean that the design leadership is going to come from places that design leadership hasn't come from in the past? Like I've been seeing a lot of researchers becoming design leaders now. Is that a trend that you are seeing? Is that a trend that you're seeing inside Lattice and in the industry, where design leadership is now not just people who spend 10 years, 15 years, 20 years doing visual design, but is it people who have kind of various exposure, not just product and product design, but other parts of the org?
I do see that. I think that in the next, call it 5 years or so, we will probably see more research leaders growing into design org leaders. I can actually think of a few already where this has happened. Like I think Hannah at Segment, for example, is one, right? I think that beyond the subdisciplines of design, if we're talking like PM, engineering, business, I don't see why not. Probably not over the next 5 years, but over the next like 10 to 15, I don't see why not. But again, this is all operating on the hypothesis that design's focus will skew more to the first of the two diamonds, right? If that does not happen, then all the arguments I'm building goes out the door with it, right? But if it does, then I do think that the lanes or the roads that lead to a head of design role, like there'll be more of those. I do recognize though that as I'm saying all this, one existential question might arise, which is like, does this mark the end of like the craft part of the design practice? And I don't think so, right? I think that even when design systems started becoming a thing, it opened up this question of like, oh, well, like, then like, where do I get to like be creative and all that, right? And I've heard a couple of framings around this that I've really appreciated. One is like design systems raise the floor, which then enables designers to raise the ceiling, right? So it's kind of like raising the standard, the bare minimum standard of an experience, and really crystallizing and defining things that are agnostic to like a customer persona or like the team that you're on, just standards, right? And then that actually gives a designer back time to then focus on the key areas or key places where they can raise the ceiling and really dream and push things forward, right? I think all this commoditization within like design tooling and all that stuff just does that even more, right? It probably means like fewer places that we're focusing, but then like, again, same number of hours in the day, the things that we can then dream and push on, I think will be that much more creative and interesting, right? So I think both things can be true. I think that like we can skew our focus more to the former diamond, but then as the commoditization happens for the latter diamond, it just it focuses the places that we then focus our creative and craftsmanship energy.
That's a really good, and honestly, I do believe that this idea of I don't know if I would call it commoditization, but the idea of double diamond, the idea that the focus is shifting from what to build, from how to build to what to build, is absolutely true. And I'm a lot less skeptical of that than or a lot more confident in that future.
Yeah.
By the way, so for those of you listening, if you have any questions, this is the time to put those questions in. I've been taking all the space in the room and asking all of my questions. But if you folks have any questions, please either put those in the chat or put that in the Q&A section. So Jared, this idea now, future that we have explored, talked about what it means for designers, what it means for leaders. Now, if I was an aspiring leader, if I was, mid-career or early career person, design or product management or research or even engineering or any kind of related to customer success, I've started to see a lot more customer success people coming in to design as well. If I had an ambition, would be like you, wanted to run an org, be the head of design, what path would I take? What skills would I want to build? What would your advice be to a person who wants to be where you are today?
Yeah. So I have a few thoughts here. I think the earlier you are in your career, the less wrong you can do. In terms of like most things, most opportunities that you see before you, you should just optimize for learning. Like, what are you most interested in learning? And then just pursue that. Like, when I think about like a lot of the early decisions I made in my career, they weren't that strategic. Like, it was just like, I'm just really curious about learning this thing. And I just learned it. And over time, it kind of formed my identity as a professional. But I did not lead with the identity I wanted to have, because like I was given the advice of like, hey, you're probably going to be wrong on what you pick, right? So just learn. So this idea of just optimizing for learning and like recognizing that like the risk of the decisions that you make professionally in terms of what you pursue are likely very, very low in the early years. It's just really, really freeing, right? And like it allows you to actually have fun and not take yourself too seriously. I think beyond that, though, is as you start to mature down a particular lane that you take, and you're now thinking about like, moving into management and leadership and all that stuff, is understanding that like, there's high level pillars to successful leadership that are agnostic of domain, discipline, or stage of company. But then when you come down one level of abstraction, there are certain profiles of leadership that are conducive to certain environments and certain stages of business. And knowing this helps you pursue leadership in the scenario that is most congruent with what you can provide, right? So what I mean by this is like, if you look at like the VP of product or head of product role, right? in most companies, that role does not, like, a person does not stay in that role for like longer than 2 or 3 years. They'll just kind of, the company will just go through a lot of them. And you can see that on paper or on LinkedIn and be like, oh, this company has a problem. Why can't they keep their leaders? And it's like, it's actually not that. It's that what the business needs changes so drastically through these inflection points that there's certain profiles of leadership or kind of like personas of leadership that lend themselves well throughout different stages, right? So as you go down your path of management into leadership over time, something that you do want to start to develop, and it's good to do this through like, like talking out loud to other people and starting to like understand yourself a bit more, getting a coach and all that stuff. When you begin to understand like what kind of profile you are, then you'll pursue the opportunities that allow you to really maximize the value you can have to a business, right? Because the worst thing to do is to have a really, really strong leadership archetype, but then put yourself in the wrong environment, right? Like there are leaders that are like, they're all about 0 to 1, where they're like, bring me in early, let me help you get from nothing to something. And then when you're at something and you need process and structure, I'm out, right? And it's not like, oh, I'm a bad leader. It's like, I'm really, really good at this phase, right? And then there are leaders where they're like, oh, blank canvas, that gives me like nightmares. What I like is to bring process and order and structure, right? So you bring them in right when you hit product market fit, where you now need to like start laying down practices for like, recruiting and like learning how to scale a team. And then there are people where it's like, okay, once I do that and now we hit scale and now you need me to like just like 10x this org and 10x the opportunity. I can't do that. I don't think in orders of magnitude. I think in linear, right? Cool. Then right? So like over time, like this is not something you'll understand day one, but over time you'll begin to understand like, what do you like accelerating? Do you like accelerating nothing to something? Do you like accelerating something to scale? Do you like accelerating something from scale to like infinite scale, right? And then you find the opportunities that help you really maximize the value you can have on businesses, right? That's another thing that comes to mind. And then the last thing I'll say is like, I know this is a very common piece of advice, but I'll say it because it's right, is to build your kind of like support system or mentorship group, right? I think 2 early things that helped me when I started doing this was one, understanding the difference between a mentor and a coach, right? Like they're not the same thing, right? A mentor, it's more like a pull relationship. Like I have a thing I'm dealing with, like this person's good at that, let me like ping them and ask them for help, right? I see a lot of people email someone and say like, hey, I'd like you to be my mentor, can we meet monthly? I'm like, that's not a mentor, that's a coach, right? A coach serves a different purpose. So understanding the difference between those two. And then the other thing I would pair that with is understanding that when it comes to a mentor in particular, it's actually good to have a few mentors, not just one, right? And understand what they're uniquely good at. So for me, I have a Rolodex of people, right? Where it's like, oh, if I'm dealing with like org design, these are my 2 people who I go to, but I would not ask them about like, like design strategy, because that's not their superpower. Maybe I have these 2 people who are really good at design strategy, but org design is not their superpower, right? So I've kind of like built up a Rolodex of people where it's like problem, mentor, like, the group of people who can help me here, right? So I think that those are 2 good elements to think about when you're starting to build out your support system. I think a third nugget that I would add to the support system route is that, as you're now growing in your career, it's usually good to have people who are ahead of you, people who are moving alongside you, and then people who are behind you. So what I mean by that is like the mentor and coach really help for the people who are ahead of you, right? People who've done the thing you've done before, who can kind of like give you guidance and like help you like avoid, walls, right? But it's also good to have people alongside you, people who are like kind of like in the race at the same like stage or whatnot, dealing with the same challenges, right? It allows you to knowledge share, knowledge transfer, all that stuff. And then the people behind you, the folks that you are now giving your time and attention back to, I actually think there's a selfless benefit to it, but there's also a selfish benefit to it, which is if you've ever tried to coach someone on something, it actually reinforces your own learnings, right? Like anytime I hop off a mentorship call, I leave with a to-do list of things that I need to do. Like halfway through, I realize I'm starting to talk to myself, right? Like I'm reminding myself of my own lessons. And then like, oh crap, I should actually go email that or go do that thing or whatnot, right? So those are kind of like the 3 things I would say there, right? Like understand the difference between mentor and coach. On the mentorship side, how to Rolodex, people who map to different areas, understanding that no particular person is good at everything. And then like when you now complete that circle, have people ahead, people beside, people behind.
That's great advice. And honestly, I got this. I have never, in the startup world and CEO world, like people talk about having CEO coaches, but I never thought about the difference between coach and mentor. So there's a question that's kind of came in from Phil. Do you mind expanding more on the difference between coach versus mentor relationship? What do you do different? Yeah. You're mostly mentorship. I don't know if you do coaching as well. But what do you
I
do
coach
different
one
is,
person,
yeah. Oh, you coach one person. What
yeah.
is it? What do you do differently?
Yeah, so mentorship, like I mentioned, is more a pull relationship, right? Like a mentor, honestly, should, if they check in on you, that's just icing on the cake. But if they never do, like they haven't failed as a mentor, right? They show up as a mentor when you pull from them, like I need this thing. They tell you what you need to know, right? And that's it. A coach is more an accountability partner, right? Like the coach needs to learn how you think, right? Like almost like your failure mode thought cycles so that they can catch you when you go into them, right? So for example, I know that one of mine is that like, if you give me a subject and you give me an infinite amount of time to talk about it, I can convince you about whatever I want to convince you about like over some period of time, right? But that's the thing that I need to be caught on by my coach, because then if I'm trying to really like correct something or change something about myself, I can't convince myself that like the next action is no action, right? So I need my coach to catch me there, right? But in order for them to catch me, we actually have to have like a standing relationship set up. We need to be like meeting weekly or monthly or what have you, right? As part of that too, you should be aligning on your goals with your coach, right? So that they kind of like hold you accountable to that. Like, are you actually progressing? But I think that like a coach, really, when you have that structure, they're holding up a mirror. They're helping you identify like when your own thought cycles or thought patterns are getting in the way of the goals that you want to have. They know the goals you have and they kind of pester you, right? Like they're almost like this, like just slightly annoying. A mentor is never going to be annoying, right? They're going to tell you the thing that you want to know. A coach is like, they're just a little bit annoying, right? So if your mentor is annoying you, maybe they should be your coach, right? And if your coach isn't annoying you, maybe they should be your mentor.
That's great advice. That's great advice for coach and mentors, not just people who are looking for that. There was one question that I skipped. In the world of this, double diamond, in the world where, like, you spoke about building the right thing versus the building thing right. And as designers, there's kind of this push and pull relationship there, where you want to build the thing right, but then there's all this push on like building an MVP and getting in front of the users as quickly as possible without waiting for like. I don't necessarily agree with what I'm saying, but that's what people have been talking about, is this idea of like, let's put something out there, see where it goes. You don't need like a lot of customer feedback before you build something out, before MVP out. What are your thoughts on that, and what do you guide your team or people you're mentoring on how do you reconcile that?
It's a good question. I think that the discussion is set up to fail if the operating model you're trying to get to is incongruent with what the company values. So fundamentally, a company can either be risk on or risk off, right? Like either they're like in value protection mode, let's get as few things wrong as possible, or they're like in value creation mode, where it's like let's put out ideas there, see what resonates, and then like we double down on the things that resonate. I think most companies, especially most tech companies, start the latter, risk off, or on, sorry, like let's put stuff out there and try and stay that way as long as possible, because like gravity will pull you to risk on. Gravity will pull you to risk off as the business matures and gets bigger, right? So if you are trying to be risk on, if you're trying to like go as quickly as possible and learn stuff and throw as many things at the wall and see what sticks, then your development process needs to be congruent with that, right? And what that lends itself to is that the development process needs to be less about like validation and more about building confidence, right? So validation is like, it's binary, right? Like this is either right or wrong. So if you optimize for that, you're going to have very, very heavy processes. Things are going to take a long time to ship. You're going to need to hit statistical significance on everything. A lot of people and a lot of data points are going to be involved in every decision, right? And for a company that's risk off, that's right. But again, most tech companies are not, right? So what does risk on look like? It's more around your time to learning, right? We have enough level of confidence to believe that this is worth pursuing, so we're going to put it out there. And once it's out there, we're going to see how people react to it. And based off of how people react, we'll come back and like, right. And then you're building and over time, you're building your confidence, and you're also building the maturity of whatever thing that you're actually shipping, right? And I think that then lends itself to well, then do we need to talk to 50 people or will 5 suffice? Well, 5 tends to suffice, right? Like around that number, there's a bunch of papers that actually prove this. Like around that number begins to be a drop off in diminishing returns, for like what net new insight you might actually get, right? It also changes the way in which you show up to those calls. You're not coming to the customer for the answer, you're coming to the customer for an insight, right? Because answer is to validate, insight is to build confidence, right? So it just shapes all the different ways in which you show up on the work. But again, all those conversations and all those practices are moot if they're not aligned with what the company's optimizing for, right? So ask your boss, ask your manager, like, hey, are we in risk on or risk off mode, right? Like, are we about protect the money we have or get as much more money as we can have? And depending upon what that is, and that then makes it very clear how you should be thinking about the work and approaching your processes.
That is absolutely fantastic answer. We have one more question coming in. Where did you find the coaches and mentors that you work with, and how were you found by your mentees and people you're coaching?
That's a great question. So a practice I used to do very early, and I learned it from someone, so I won't take credit like it came from my brain, but was ask your folks for folks. Basically, if you don't know someone, ask them for mentorship or whatnot. But if you don't believe that you have a person within your circle, people tend to undervalue the richness of their second degree network, right? Like the people who your people know, right? So if you're trying to find someone for something, just ask people like, hey, who are the best people you know in this thing? And it just widens the reach that you have. One of my closest mentors is Bob Baxley. He leads design at ThoughtSquad. And how I got in contact with him was years ago. I was building this thing called Playbook, which was like it still exists, but it's kind of like this knowledge learning platform for product designers, right? For designers. And I knew that fundamentally what I was building was a Q&A platform. So I wanted to understand Q&A design, right? So I asked some friends, I'm like, hey, oh, that's awesome. I wanted to ask some friends hey, who's the best Q&A people, right? And then someone was like, have you met Bob? He was the first design leader for Yahoo Answers, one of the oldest Q&A things. I'm like, I need to talk to Bob, right? And I started meeting with Bob, and then over time, we developed that relationship, right? So, it started with a very tactical thing. I wanted to know how to build Playbook well, but then it's kind of graduated into general design leadership now, right? But I never would have met him if I just relied on my first degree contact. So my key insight there is ask the people you know who they know, and you will likely find someone. And then I think the second part of the question was, how do people find me? I think it's similar, right? I think they're most of the things are introductions, which then, presumes that someone asked someone, and then that person said, you should talk to Jared.
That's fantastic. Well, that's all the time we had today. For those of you who don't know Marvin is a user research platform, a user research repository. So check us out at heymarvin.com. Unless there are any final questions for Jared, we're gonna call the conversation to an end. Thank you so much, Jared. This has been one of the most eye-opening, one of the most insightful conversations that I've ever been part of. So thank you so much. We'll do this again. We'll have you come back and talk more. There's so much learning here. There's so much you can learn, actively include in your life. This has been an amazing conversation. So thank you, Jared, for coming. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we'll see you next month.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Bye, everyone.
I'll see you.